The Manhattan skyline stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of Romano Enterprises, each glittering light a reminder of dreams I'd once harbored before fear became my constant companion. My fingers moved mechanically across the keyboard, transcribing documents that blurred together in my exhaustion, while the weight of foundation and powder on my face felt like a mask I could never remove. The luxury of this 42nd floor corner office stood in sharp contrast to the nightmare that awaited me each evening in a cramped Brooklyn walk-up where love had twisted into something monstrous and unrecognizable. Every keystroke sent shooting pain through my wrist where Marcus had grabbed me last Tuesday, his rage triggered by nothing more than my suggestion that we needed groceries, but I'd learned to type through pain just as I'd learned to smile through terror. The subtle fragrance of imported leather and aged whiskey that permeated Alessandro Romano's domain had become oddly comforting, a scent that represented order and control in a world where I possessed neither. My reflection in the darkened computer screen showed a woman I barely recognized anymore, hollow-eyed despite the careful application of brightening concealer, her collarbones too prominent beneath the silk blouse I'd chosen specifically because it covered the fingerprint bruises on my upper arms. The salary from this position should have been enough to live comfortably, to help my aging father with his medical bills, to maybe even save for a future that once seemed possible. Instead, every dollar disappeared into Marcus's demands, funding his unemployment and his escalating substance dependencies while I survived on vending machine crackers and the occasional bagel from the break room that no one else wanted. The other assistants chatted freely about their weekend plans and dinner reservations at restaurants I could no longer afford, their normalcy a painful reminder of the woman I used to be before I'd mistaken possessiveness for passion. My hand shook slightly as I reached for my coffee, the tremor a combination of hunger, exhaustion, and the perpetual anxiety that had become my baseline state of existence. Alessandro Romano's schedule demanded precision that left no room for the chaos consuming my personal life, and somehow maintaining that professional excellence had become the only source of pride I had left in a world that felt increasingly suffocating. He was a man of exacting standards and few words, his reputation in the business world built on an iron will and an uncanny ability to identify weakness in opponents and opportunities where others saw only obstacles. I'd been his personal assistant for 11 months, long enough to understand that his legitimate real estate empire was merely the visible portion of his influence, that the men who visited after hours spoke in careful euphemisms about shipments and territories and resolving problems. The knowledge should have frightened me, but fear had become so familiar that I'd developed a strange immunity to new sources of it, and besides, Mr. Romano had never been anything but courteous in his interactions with me. His dark eyes would occasionally linger on my face with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, something that looked almost like concern, but I'd learned not to trust my instincts about men and their intentions. The office phone's sharp ring cut through my thoughts, and I answered with the practiced professionalism that had become second nature, my voice steady despite the way my ribs ached from where Marcus had shoved me against the kitchen counter this morning. Mr. Romano needed the Castellano contracts immediately, his voice carrying that particular edge that meant he was negotiating something significant, something that required every detail to be flawless because mistakes in his world carried consequences I preferred not to imagine. I gathered the thick folder with hands that had learned to move efficiently despite pain, straightening my posture before entering his private office, aware that any sign of weakness would invite questions I couldn't afford to answer. The afternoon sun slanted through his windows, illuminating the expensive art collection that lined his walls, pieces I recognized from my art history degree, the education I'd abandoned when Marcus convinced me that my dreams were selfish indulgences that took attention away from our relationship. That life felt like it belonged to someone else entirely, a naive girl who believed that love meant supporting your partner unconditionally, even when that support required sacrificing everything you'd worked to become. My exit from his office was intercepted by Vincent, one of Mr. Romano's security detail, whose knowing eyes seemed to catalogue every careful movement I made, every flinch I couldn't quite suppress when someone approached too quickly. He said nothing, but his expression carried a weight of understanding that made my throat tight with unshed tears I refused to release because crying would smudge my makeup and reveal the purple shadows beneath. The remainder of my workday passed in a haze of phone calls and correspondence, each task completed with mechanical efficiency while my mind counted down the hours until I'd have to return home to face whatever mood Marcus would be in tonight. The setting sun painted the city in shades of amber and crimson, beautiful and indifferent to the small tragedies playing out in apartments and offices across its vast expanse, and I found myself wishing I could simply disappear into that golden light and emerge somewhere new, someone who hadn't made the catastrophic mistake of loving the wrong man. Monday morning arrived with the bruise on my temple that no amount of concealer could fully hide, a souvenir from Marcus's fist connecting with my face when I'd asked why he needed my credit card again after maxing it out the previous week. The subway ride to work felt longer than usual, every jarring stop sending waves of nausea through me, though I couldn't be certain if that was from the concussion I suspected I had or simply the bone-deep exhaustion of existing in a constant state of hypervigilance. My fellow commuters remained absorbed in their phones and newspapers, oblivious to the woman standing among them who was slowly disappearing, eroding bit by bit under the weight of violence masquerading as love. The familiar route from the station to Romano Enterprises usually took 12 minutes, but today each step felt like walking through water, my body protesting movement while my mind rehearsed the lies I'd need to tell if anyone asked about the visible evidence of Marcus's latest outburst. The morning air carried the scent of coffee and exhaust and possibility for everyone except me. Everyone except those of us trapped in situations we'd once believed we could control or change or survive through sheer determination. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor provided a moment of solitude where I could let my professional mask slip, my reflection in the polished brass showing a woman who looked like she'd aged a decade in less than a year. My finger touched the tender spot on my temple gingerly, and I fought back the wave of shame that always accompanied these visible marks, the internalized belief that somehow I'd earned this treatment through some failure of my own. The doors opened to reveal the pristine reception area of Romano Enterprises, all marble and chrome and understated wealth, a world away from the squalor my life had become in Marcus's orbit. Sarah, the receptionist, looked up with her usual cheerful greeting, but her smile faltered when she saw my face, her eyes widening fractionally before professional courtesy reasserted itself and she looked quickly away. That moment of recognition, of being seen as a victim rather than simply as Alessandro Romano's efficient personal assistant, made something inside me crack just a little bit more. My desk sat in the antechamber to Mr. Romano's private office, positioned to intercept visitors and manage his schedule with the precision of a military operation, and I'd taken pride in my ability to anticipate his needs before he voiced them. Today, however, my usual efficiency felt beyond my grasp, my thoughts scattered and my hands clumsy as I attempted to organize the morning's priorities while fighting against the pounding headache that made the fluorescent lights feel like knives behind my eyes. The bruise throbbed in time with my heartbeat, a constant reminder of my failure to avoid Marcus's rage, to say the right thing or stay silent at the right moment or simply to cease existing in ways that triggered his increasingly volatile temper. I just managed to boot up my computer when I heard the distinctive sound of Mr. Romano's arrival, his footsteps purposeful and measured, carrying the confidence of a man who'd never had to make himself smaller to survive someone else's anger. My spine straightened automatically, muscle memory overriding physical discomfort, because this job was the only thing I had left and I couldn't afford to lose it through visible weakness. Alessandro Romano stopped beside my desk rather than proceeding directly to his office as was his custom, and the sudden deviation from routine made my stomach clench with apprehension that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with learned responses to unpredictability. His presence felt substantial in a way that went beyond physical size, an aura of controlled power that made people instinctively step aside when he walked through a room, and today that attention focused entirely on my face with an intensity that made it impossible to avoid his gaze. I watched his expression transform as he registered the bruise, watched something dangerous and cold settle into features that were usually carefully neutral, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly while his hands clenched briefly before he forced them to relax at his sides. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unasked questions and answers I couldn't provide without shattering what remained of my pride, and I found myself holding my breath while waiting for him to either dismiss the evidence before him or demand an explanation I wasn't prepared to give. When Mr. Romano finally spoke, his voice was deceptively soft, carrying an undercurrent of barely restrained fury that wasn't directed at me but at the situation itself, at whoever had dared to mark someone under his employ in such a brutal fashion. He asked me to follow him into his office, the request phrased politely but carrying the weight of a command that I knew better than to refuse, and my legs felt unsteady as I rose from my desk. The walk from my station to his private domain took only seconds, but it felt like crossing a threshold from which there would be no return, as if speaking the truth about Marcus would make it somehow more real than it already was. His office door closed behind us with a definitive click, sealing us in a space that suddenly felt more intimate than any executive suite had a right to be, and I stood before his massive desk feeling exposed despite being fully clothed. The view of Manhattan spread behind him like a kingdom he ruled from this glass tower, and I wondered what it must be like to have that kind of power, that kind of control over your own existence and the ability to shape the world according to your will rather than simply surviving whatever cruelties it inflicted. Alessandro Romano moved around his desk with a predator's grace, eliminating the barrier of furniture between us, and gestured toward the leather chairs positioned near the windows where he occasionally conducted less formal meetings with associates whose business required discretion. My body moved automatically to comply, years of following instructions having trained me to obey without question, but my mind raced with calculations about how to deflect the conversation I knew was coming. The chair felt too soft after the hard wooden seat at my desk, and I perched on its edge rather than settling back, maintaining the posture of someone ready to flee even though there was nowhere to run from the concern I saw in his dark eyes. He settled into the chair opposite mine rather than maintaining the position of authority behind his desk, and the gesture felt significant somehow, as if he were deliberately trying to minimize the power differential between employer and employee for this particular conversation. The question came without preamble, direct and impossible to misunderstand, as Mr. Romano asked who had put their hands on me in a tone that suggested he already knew the answer but needed to hear me confirm it. My throat felt tight, words catching against pride and shame and the desperate need to maintain the illusion that I had any control over my own life, even as evidence to the contrary literally marked my skin. I attempted the usual deflection, the story about clumsiness that had become so practiced I almost believed it myself, but he cut through my lies with surgical precision, his expression making it clear that he wouldn't accept anything less than the truth. The tears I'd been holding back for days suddenly threatened to overflow, and I pressed my palms against my eyes, trying to physically stop the emotional breakdown I could feel building behind my carefully maintained composure. His hand appeared in my peripheral vision, offering a handkerchief of fine linen embroidered with his initials, and the simple gesture of kindness nearly destroyed what remained of my defenses. Marcus's name left my lips in a whisper, and with it came the flood of details I'd kept locked away for months, the gradual escalation from verbal abuse to physical violence, the way he'd isolated me from friends and family until this job was my only connection to the outside world. I told him about the financial control, how Marcus took my paychecks and left me with barely enough for subway fare, about the accusations of infidelity whenever I worked late, about the threats he'd made if I ever tried to leave him. Mr. Romano listened with absolute stillness, the kind of focused attention that made me feel simultaneously exposed and seen in ways I hadn't experienced since long before Marcus entered my life, and I watched his hands gradually curl into fists as the full scope of my situation became apparent. The telling of it felt like lancing an infected wound, painful but necessary, and when I finally fell silent, the weight of having spoken these truths aloud settled over me with surprising relief. The response wasn't what I expected. Instead of pity or the awkward discomfort most people displayed when confronted with domestic violence, Alessandro Romano's face took on an expression of calculated fury that somehow made me feel safer rather than more frightened. He explained, in that careful way of his that suggested he was choosing each word with precision, that this situation was unacceptable and would be addressed immediately, using language that might have seemed ambiguous to someone who didn't understand the nature of his true business. His questions became more specific, tactical even, as he extracted details about Marcus's routine, his workplace, his known associates, information I provided without fully understanding why he needed such comprehensive intelligence. The conversation had transformed from employer checking on employee welfare to something else entirely, something that felt like a general planning a military operation, and I realized with a strange mixture of terror and hope that Alessandro Romano was offering protection of a sort that existed entirely outside legal channels. When he asked if I was prepared for what it would mean to accept his help, the weight of that question settled over me like a physical thing, carrying implications that went far beyond simply leaving an abusive relationship. I understood, perhaps better than he thought I did, that the kind of intervention he was suggesting wouldn't involve restraining orders or police reports or the systems designed to protect women in my situation but which so often failed them. His help would be permanent, absolute, and irreversible, the kind of solution that powerful men enacted when someone threatened what they decided belonged under their protection. The choice he presented wasn't really about Marcus anymore, but about what kind of life I wanted moving forward. Whether I was willing to step into a world where problems were solved through means that existed in shadows and back rooms and careful euphemisms. My answer came more easily than it should have, a simple affirmative that acknowledged I'd reached a point where conventional solutions felt like inadequate defenses against a threat that was escalating toward an inevitable violent conclusion. The hotel suite Alessandro arranged for me that evening occupied an entire floor of the Carlyle, the kind of establishment where discretion was as valued as luxury and where guests paid premium prices for the assurance that their business remained private. I stood at windows overlooking a city transformed by night into a constellation of lights, each one representing lives being lived in ways both mundane and extraordinary, while mine balanced on the precipice of transformation I couldn't fully comprehend. The suite itself felt impossibly vast after Marcus's claustrophobic apartment, all cream marble and gold fixtures and furniture that probably cost more than I made in 6 months, a temporary sanctuary that felt both dreamlike and somehow inevitable given the trajectory my life had taken. Vincent had escorted me here after I'd returned to the apartment Marcus and I shared just long enough to collect essentials, his silent presence preventing any confrontation with my boyfriend who thankfully had been absent during that brief and terrifying retrieval mission. The text message I'd sent Marcus claimed a family emergency requiring my immediate departure to Philadelphia, another lie added to the thousands I'd already told, but this one felt different because it represented the beginning of my disappearance from his life rather than just another temporary reprieve. Sleep came fitfully that first night, my body unable to fully relax despite the luxurious bed and the knowledge that Marcus didn't know this location, conditioned responses to months of hypervigilance refusing to quiet simply because my circumstances had changed. I woke repeatedly to sounds that in my apartment would have signaled his return, his mood readable in the weight of his footsteps and the force with which he closed the door, but here there was only silence broken occasionally by the distant hum of the city 40 stories below. Morning arrived with room service I hadn't ordered, breakfast more elaborate than anything I'd eaten in months, accompanied by a note in Alessandro's distinctive handwriting instructing me to rest and promising he would visit that evening. The food tasted impossibly good after existing primarily on whatever cheap staples Marcus deemed acceptable for me to purchase, and I found myself eating slowly, savoring each bite while my mind tried to process the surreal shift my existence had undergone in less than 24 hours. The day passed in a strange limbo where I occupied this beautiful space but felt untethered from reality, occasionally checking my phone to find increasingly frantic messages from Marcus demanding to know where I was and when I'd return. His texts followed a familiar pattern, beginning with concern that quickly devolved into accusations and threats, the digital manifestation of the cycle I'd lived through countless times in person, but reading them from the safety of this suite made them feel less potent somehow. I didn't respond, following Alessandro's explicit instructions to maintain complete silence, to let Marcus wonder and worry and eventually realize that I'd slipped beyond his reach, and the power in that silence felt intoxicating after so long spent carefully managing his moods through constant communication. The afternoon stretched toward evening, and I found myself anticipating Alessandro's arrival with an emotion that wasn't quite anxiety but something more complex, a recognition that his intervention in my life had created an obligation I didn't yet fully understand. Alessandro arrived precisely at 7, his timing as impeccable as everything else about him, and the look he gave me held layers of meaning I was only beginning to decipher through the careful neutrality of his expression. He'd changed from his business attire into more casual clothing that somehow made him seem both more approachable and more dangerous, the expensive fabrics unable to disguise the physical power in his frame or the predatory awareness in his movements. We sat in the suite's living area, and he explained with careful precision that Marcus Mitchell had been reported missing by his supervisor when he'd failed to appear for his warehouse shift, that a welfare check had found his apartment apparently abandoned with signs of a hasty departure. The information was delivered calmly, clinically, with no explicit acknowledgement of how this situation had come to pass, but the implication hung heavy in the air between us, the understanding that the man who'd terrorized me for months had simply ceased to exist in any meaningful way. My reaction surprised me. Instead of horror or guilt or any of the emotions I'd anticipated feeling at news of Marcus's disappearance, I felt a wave of relief so profound it was almost painful, as if someone had removed a crushing weight I'd grown so accustomed to carrying I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. Alessandro watched my face carefully as I processed this information, perhaps looking for signs of distress or regret, but whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him because his expression softened fractionally. He explained that the investigation would likely be perfunctory given Marcus's history and lifestyle, that men like him disappeared regularly in a city this size and with that many dangerous habits, that without evidence of foul play the case would eventually grow cold and be filed away among thousands of other unsolved disappearances. The implicit message was clear: this problem had been solved permanently, efficiently, and in a way that would never trace back to either of us, the kind of absolute solution that existed only in the world Alessandro inhabited, where power meant the ability to reshape reality according to your will. 3 weeks passed in the strange bubble of the Carlisle suite, days that blended together in a haze of room service meals and restless sleep and gradual acceptance that my old life had ended as completely as if I'd died and been reborn into this new existence. Alessandro visited regularly, always in the evening after his legitimate business concluded, bringing news from the outside world and gradually sharing more about himself than our previous employer-employee relationship had ever permitted. I learned about his family's history, the grandfather who'd built their empire through a combination of legitimate business acumen and strategic alliances that existed in moral grey areas, the father who'd expanded that influence across multiple states and industries. He spoke about the weight of inheriting such power, the constant calculations required to maintain control while projecting an image of corporate respectability, and I began to understand that the man I'd worked for was merely one facet of someone far more complex and dangerous than I'd imagined. Our conversations evolved beyond the practical matters of my situation into something deeper, discussions about literature and art and philosophy that reminded me of the person I'd been before Marcus had slowly eroded my sense of self through systematic abuse and isolation. Alessandro brought books from his personal collection, first editions, and rare volumes he handled with reverence, and we spent hours discussing their themes and meanings while the city glittered below us like scattered diamonds. These intellectual connections felt unexpectedly intimate, revealing a side of him that existed separately from both his business persona and his role as protector, someone who valued ideas and beauty and the life of the mind. I found myself looking forward to these evenings with an anticipation that had nothing to do with gratitude for his intervention and everything to do with genuine enjoyment of his company, the way his mind worked through problems, the dry humor that occasionally surfaced beneath his serious demeanor. The physical attraction I'd been carefully ignoring since my first days working for him became impossible to deny in the close quarters of these evening visits, awareness crackling between us during moments when his hand would brush mine passing a book or when our eyes would meet across the space of the sitting area. I told myself it was simply transference, gratitude manifesting as romantic interest, the predictable response of someone who'd been rescued from a nightmare by someone powerful and attentive. But the explanation felt insufficient when my pulse would race at the sound of his knock on the suite door. Alessandro maintained careful distance despite the chemistry that seemed to intensify with each passing day, his respect for my traumatized state evident in the way he never pushed boundaries or made assumptions about what I might owe him for his protection. That consideration made him more attractive rather than less, the restraint of someone who could take what he wanted but chose to wait for it to be freely offered instead. The conversation that shifted everything happened on a rainy Thursday evening, water streaming down the windows and turning the city lights into abstract watercolor impressions while we discussed the future in concrete terms rather than the vague reassurances that had characterized our previous talks. Alessandro explained that I couldn't return to my position as his personal assistant, that the professional relationship we'd maintained had been irreversibly altered by recent events, and my heart sank with the assumption that this meant our connection would end entirely. Instead, he proposed something unexpected, offering me a position managing his personal affairs from a residence he owned in the city, a role that would provide both employment and security while allowing me space to heal and determine what I wanted from a life that was finally my own to direct. The offer was generous beyond measure, but I heard what he wasn't saying, the implication that this arrangement would keep me in his orbit, connected to him in ways that went beyond simple employment or even protective obligation. My response emerged before I'd fully thought through the implications, an admission that what I wanted wasn't just safety or employment but him, this complicated and dangerous man who'd shown me more genuine care in 3 weeks than Marcus had in all our time together. The words hung in the air between us, vulnerable and honest, and I watched Alessandro's careful control fracture for the first time since I'd known him, something raw and hungry emerging in his expression. He crossed the distance between us slowly, giving me every opportunity to retreat or reconsider. But I met him halfway, and when his lips finally touched mine, it was nothing like the brutal possessive kisses Marcus had forced on me. This was gentle exploration, restrained desire, the kiss of someone who understood that passion didn't require violence and that claiming someone could be an act of cherishing rather than domination. When we finally separated, his forehead resting against mine while we both struggled to regulate our breathing, he asked if I was certain about wanting this, about wanting him despite everything I knew about the darkness in his world, and my affirmative response carried the weight of choice made with clear eyes and full understanding of consequences. The penthouse Alessandro brought me to the following week occupied the top 3 floors of a building his family owned in the financial district, a space that redefined my understanding of wealth and what it meant to live without limitations or constraints. My quarters consisted of an entire floor, bedroom, and sitting room and private terrace overlooking the East River, decorated with understated elegance that somehow felt simultaneously luxurious and comfortable. The wardrobe had been filled with clothing in my exact size, designer pieces that made my previous professional attire look shabby by comparison, and the bathroom featured fixtures that probably cost more than a year of my former salary. Alessandro's private floors occupied the spaces above and below mine, an arrangement that provided both proximity and independence, the physical manifestation of his commitment to letting me choose how close I wanted to be rather than assuming his protection entitled him to unrestricted access. Settling into this new existence required adjustments that went beyond the merely physical, learning to accept help from staff who appeared silently to handle cooking and cleaning and the thousand small details of daily life I'd always managed myself. The psychological shift from survival mode to actual living proved more challenging than I'd anticipated. Months of hypervigilance not simply switching off because my circumstances had improved, and I found myself still flinching at sudden sounds or checking locks multiple times before bed. Alessandro noticed these lingering trauma responses with the same careful attention he brought to everything else, arranging for a therapist who specialized in abuse recovery and who asked no questions about the circumstances that had removed my abuser from the picture so permanently. The sessions were difficult, forcing me to confront not just Marcus's violence but my own choices and the gradual erosion of self that had allowed me to remain in that situation far longer than objective observers might have thought reasonable. The evolution of my relationship with Alessandro happened gradually, built on foundations of genuine respect and intellectual compatibility rather than just the intensity of our initial circumstances or the undeniable physical chemistry between us. We fell into rhythms that felt surprisingly domestic despite the extraordinary nature of our arrangement, sharing breakfast when our schedules aligned, discussing our respective days over dinner, occasionally watching old films in his private screening room while sitting close enough to feel the warmth of each other's presence. He introduced me to aspects of his legitimate business, seeking my opinion on matters where my perspective might prove valuable, treating me as a partner whose intelligence he respected rather than simply someone under his protection. The physical intimacy between us deepened in increments I controlled, each step forward my decision to make, and the patience he showed in letting me set that pace made me trust him in ways I'd never trusted anyone. The moment that tested everything came 6 weeks into my new life, when Vincent appeared at my door with information that Marcus's body had been discovered in a construction site in New Jersey. The investigation determining his death was likely connected to drug-related activities given the company he'd been keeping in his final weeks. The news should have brought relief, closure, confirmation that the threat was truly gone, but instead it triggered a crisis of conscience I hadn't anticipated, forcing me to confront what accepting Alessandro's protection had actually meant. I found him in his study, surrounded by paperwork and looking every inch the legitimate businessman he presented to the world, and demanded the truth without the careful euphemisms we'd both been using to avoid explicitly acknowledging what had happened. His honesty was brutal and complete, explaining that Marcus's disappearance had always been intended as permanent solution, that his body's eventual discovery had been calculated to close the investigation without raising uncomfortable questions about who might have ordered such decisive action. The choice I faced wasn't whether to stay or leave, though Alessandro made it clear that decision remained entirely mine and that choosing to walk away would come with resources and protection sufficient to build whatever life I wanted elsewhere. Instead, the choice was about accepting who I'd become in choosing this path, acknowledging that my safety and happiness had been purchased through violence I'd implicitly sanctioned by accepting help I knew would be delivered through extralegal means. I thought about the woman I'd been before Marcus, full of ideals about right and wrong and simple moral clarity, then about the woman I'd become during those months of abuse, diminished and afraid and slowly dying by degrees. The person standing in Alessandro's study represented a third iteration, someone who understood that survival sometimes required compromising absolutes, that the world contained gradients of grey that academic ethics had never prepared me to navigate. When I told him I was staying, that I chose this life and him and whatever complications came with both those decisions, his relief was evident despite his usual controlled demeanor, and I realized that my choice mattered to him in ways that went beyond mere convenience or possession. The months that followed taught me that happiness could exist even when built on morally ambiguous foundations, that love didn't require perfection from either party but rather honest acknowledgement of flaws and darkness and the willingness to accept each other completely. Alessandro's world would always contain elements that existed outside conventional law, decisions made in back rooms and problems solved through means that wouldn't bear close scrutiny, but I came to understand that within those shadows he maintained his own code of ethics about who deserved protection and who represented threats requiring elimination. My role evolved beyond simple companionship into genuine partnership, my insights proving valuable in legitimate business matters while my presence provided him something he'd apparently lacked, someone who knew the full scope of his life and chose to stay anyway. We built a life together in that penthouse, mornings of shared coffee and evenings of conversation and nights where passion mixed with genuine tenderness, the relationship deepening into something that felt solid despite its unconventional origins. I never forgot that my freedom had been purchased through Marcus's death, but I also recognized that staying with him would have eventually resulted in my own, and the choice to prioritize my survival over abstract morality felt increasingly justified as time passed and I reclaimed parts of myself I'd thought permanently lost. Standing at the penthouse windows watching the city lights reflected in the East River, Alessandro's arms wrapped around me from behind and his chin resting on my shoulder, I felt something that had been absent from my life for longer than I cared to remember. I felt safe, cherished, and genuinely hopeful about a future that finally belonged to me.